We got one more guest, one more segment here for this Wednesday edition of the show. That is with Wes Reynolds, at Wes Reynolds, the #1 on Twitter, VSIN host and contributor to the Point Spread Weekly newsletter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Adam, good morning. Good to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing well, buddy. Appreciate your time as always, man. Thank you so much for joining me here. And look, man, you know, it's week 5 of the college football season. It's week 4 of the NFL season. Feels like we should have a better handle on a lot of these teams by this point, right?
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, I think even in the NFL, it's still early because it seems like the first couple to 3 weeks are still kind of ex officio preseason games, if you will, simply because you didn't see a lot of reps for the 1s and 2s. And I think that's why until Monday night when a game went over, you saw a lot of unders really in the primetime games. And I think when you look at the top teams, I mean, there's a clear difference. It's like there's a clear top with about maybe 3 or 4 teams, or you could even maybe say 2 teams if you're just including New England and Kansas City. And then there's a clear bottom with the really bad teams, Dolphins, Jets, albeit that's a lot of injury issues, and a couple others. And then everybody else is kind of in the middle.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny because I'm kind of finding that about college football here this season too, where it's, you know, very well-defined top, very well-defined bottom, and a lot of the teams in the middle just kind of seem interchangeable in a lot of ways to me, where, you know, one team beats another team one week and then they go and beat somebody else the next week or lose to somebody they shouldn't, and you know, none of it really seems to surprise me here so far to this point here in college football. But I guess the thing I would ask you about here as we transition to focus on college, then we'll do some NFL here in a few minutes. Conference play officially underway for a lot of teams already, but now a lot of conference games in succession. Something I wanted to ask you about here today, Wes, you get a lot more trends because you've got teams that play each other year in and year out. And I think some people really rely heavily on trends. Personally, I don't. I wanted to get your take on trends here on today's show because I know a lot of it can be, you know, good Twitter fodder, or a lot of it can be justification for, you know, professional handicappers to sell plays. How do you feel about trends in particular in college football?
I think that they're useful. I mean, it really all depends, and I don't want to give like a non-answer here, but it all depends, I guess, on the context. I mean, the thing about trends is they're probably, at least in the long term, have never been more meaningless than the fact that you have a lot of coaching changes, and you don't have coaches that just stay somewhere 15 or 20 years anymore. Those are very rare in terms of how long coaches stay at a program because of just all the different changes, guys taking different jobs, guys getting burnt out and retiring, maybe going into media or whatnot. So that's one of the things I really look at in terms of trends is it going to be the same under the same coach? It does nothing to say, okay, this program is this record as a home underdog over the last 20 years. Well, probably there's been a coaching change at said program over the last 20 years. So you have to, I guess, really take that in context. And I mean, there was a trend that lost last week, going back to a game that we talked about, Michigan State Northwestern. Yeah, that the Pat Fitzgerald, like, as an underdog trend is a very good one, but that's over 15 or so years. So that's why that's probably a more pertinent trend, even though it didn't get there last week and may not this week. It's a more pertinent trend than I think something else. You have coaching changes, you have offensive scheme changes, teams that move to spread offenses that were pro style, or teams that transition from spread to pro style, or whatever it is. So you have so many different changes in this program that it's almost it is really tough to really find good trends, and you do that little, I guess, data mining, if you will, to kind of figure out which are the ones that matter.
Yeah, for sure. And also, too, you know, I mean, just the personnel changes of, you know, losing guys to the draft. I mean, now the transfer portal is a big deal. You have new players. Basically, you completely turn your roster over every 4 years. So, I don't think trends in college football are really all that significant. And I guess we're not going to talk about the NFL in depth just yet, but since we're on the subject of trends, do you subscribe to them a little bit more in the NFL where it's a little bit more of a constant, a little bit more consistent?
A little bit, I guess, in terms of just an identity of a team. And I think a lot of the NFL, too, is more scheduling dynamics, if you will, despite the fact that you only have 16 games over the course of a regular season. But you do get a lot of things that you can look at there in terms of because you get some of these teams with some of these international games like the London game or a game in Mexico City or wherever. Like you're looking at a situation that's kind of odd with the Raiders where they face the first two home games at home and then they're not home until November 3rd because in the mix of that is a bye week. And then in the mix of that is a game with Chicago over in London at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So they're essentially not playing a home game in over about a month and a half. And then with the trends in the NFL, a lot of the personnel, I mean, there are personnel changes, but the free agency in the NFL is not like what we see in the NBA, where especially this past summer, where you saw so many players and so many superstars really switch teams. In the NFL, you do still have stars that spend their whole career with one franchise, or at least they stay there through the second contract. They're not bouncing after the first contract like you kind of see in the NBA. So there is a little bit more, as you were talking about the changing in personnel, there's a bit more continuity in the personnel, I think, in the NFL.
All right, so shifting back to college here to look at a few sides that you're that you have on your radar here for this week. And game 107-108 is an interesting one. Penn State and Maryland. I talked about the video picks I did over on our Bang the Book YouTube page in the first segment. Did talk about this game over there, and you and I align on the same side here for this one. I'm not sure if it's for the same reasons, but Penn State, 6.5 point favorite, depending on where you look, for this trip out to College Park. Both teams offered some extra prep time with buys last week. What side are you looking at here, and how are you kind of breaking this one down?
Yeah, I took Maryland, and I took 7 on the buy, minus $1.20. I didn't get it right at the opener, unfortunately. But look, Maryland, I mean, it's like a stock market where you do that. I mean, it sounds so cliche, the buy low, sell high type of thing, and that's kind of what I did with Maryland at Temple when they were had opened like a touchdown favorite, and they took money when I took Temple against them because I just thought Maryland rode so high off killing a ranked Syracuse team, beat them 63-20. It was an absolute no-doubter. And then they go to Temple, and it's just like when you get a team with early success like that, they may read their own press clippings. They all of a sudden think that they're really good. And then against Temple, they weren't that great. So now the perception is back to the negative on Maryland. And then when you look at Penn State, they are 3-0, haven't really beaten anybody. They did beat Pittsburgh. Maybe the perception is a little bit higher now on that win in light of Pittsburgh upsetting UCF last week. But I just look at the fact that this is a huge game for Maryland with a new coach. These guys, they're not exactly rivals, even though they're in the same geographic area, but they are going to have their fair amount of recruiting battles for personnel, and this is a first year coach with Loxley in College Park. And look, they can score the ball, even though Temple kind of controlled them a little bit. They can score the ball here, and this is Penn State, I think, really their first big test of the season. And in their last two games against Buffalo and Pittsburgh as well, Buffalo was really more of an anomaly because Buffalo had the time of possession for like 41 minutes of the game. But Penn State got outgained in both of their last two games at home by Buffalo and Pitt. And I think the new quarterback, Clifford, I think is a more accurate passer than Trace McSorley, but I don't think he's yet proven to be the playmaker in terms of in the run or throwing, kind of getting out of the pocket in an RPO type of situation. So Look, I think Maryland kind of gets back to basics this year. Josh Jackson needs to be a little bit better on his accuracy so far because he's down to 51%. He was at like 59 at Virginia Tech. So that needs to improve if they're going to win games like this. But I think that this is a big spot for Maryland. It's a Friday night. Apparently, I just saw over the Twitter that this is sold out, which means I'm sure that there's some Penn State fans making a short trip from State College for a road game. But, yeah, I think Maryland's in a good spot here, home underdog Friday night, and I think the Terps get it done.
Yeah, this is one where my number is 4.5. So, I mean, I'm kind of trusting my power ratings a little bit here, liking the Maryland side. But, also, too, James Franklin is a master motivator. I think the bye week is good for him to kind of prop his team up a little bit. But at the same time, I'm not sold on James Franklin from an in-game standpoint. That's something I've always been worried about with him. He's pissed some games away in some big spots. I know certainly the one against Ohio State is one that comes to mind. And, Mike Locksley, it was a long time ago that he was the head coach at New Mexico. New Mexico coming off of a decade of Rocky Long. Rocky Long is very consistent. We know that 3.35 has treated him well throughout his career. They went 4-8 at New Mexico in Rocky Long's last year. As we know, winds up at San Diego State. Locksley goes out there, gets that job. Sure, I get it. He was 2-26 or whatever he was. I fully understand that. But this is also a dude that spent, the last 4 or 5 years with Alabama? I mean, if you don't pick something up from Nick Saban, what are you doing in this business? So I think that maybe Locksley's previous lack of success is a little bit overblown here. Let's keep in mind, too, that game against Temple 2 weeks ago for Maryland, they turned the ball over on downs 5 times because they were 1 for 6 on third down. It was a terrible game all around. Bad field position, awful punts, bad turnovers, bad everything. It was a great time for Maryland to get a bye, I think.
Right. I totally agree, and I think you make a good point on the Locksley in terms of how he's priced in the market, because everybody remembers the disaster in New Mexico, not only on the field but off the field, with the recruit in his car and all of those stories. But, I mean, I think getting back to basics and at least going back to Alabama, not only learning something about coaching, but just being part of a winning culture. I mean, that has to rub off on you at least a little bit. And I just thought that this was overpriced because I think, the market, it seemingly going into the season was a little lukewarm on Penn State. It's like, okay, they're Penn State. They're going to win enough games, but that they weren't really a Big Ten contender, if you will. I mean, they weren't seen going into the season as a threat to Ohio State or what we thought was Michigan as part of the Big Ten elite. But, I just think that Penn State is a little overpriced here. And, I mean, they really haven't proven anything. I think they should have lost that game to Pittsburgh, to be quite honest with you. I think Maryland is the right side here.
I'm excited to get your thoughts on this next game that you mentioned here. Game 129-130, Iowa State and Baylor. We talked about this one on yesterday's show a little bit. It's an intriguing handicap because Iowa State has played some pretty decent teams. Baylor with its usual non-conference schedule of playing virtually nobody. But this is such an interesting game because you've got Baylor now at 3-point dog at home, and you can, in fact, find 3 flat, 3 minus 15 out there. Seems like you're going a little bit contrarian with this pick.
Yeah, I am here. And, look, I like Matt Campbell a lot as a coach, and I think he's done a really good job at Iowa State. And people, I think, are still, even with the loss they took to Iowa in the Cyhawk rivalry for the 5th year in a row, still talking about them as maybe they're the team that could get Oklahoma this year in the Big 12. Maybe some people kind of go in a different way instead of going along the lines of Texas being the clear number 2 in the conference. But this is kind of a little bit of a buy low game for me as well, because you looked at Iowa State, they come off that loss and you figure, okay, that might be a real flat spot against Louisiana Monroe. And they put up, I believe, like 72 points. And I think in terms of yards, it was 714 yards. Brock Purdy threw for 435, and they really laid it on a Monroe team that was able to make a comeback. I don't know if it says more about Monroe or less about Florida State, but they were right there with Florida State, took them to overtime in Tallahassee. So, I mean, yeah, Florida State's down, but they still have talent. That's still a big-name program to be able to do that to on the road. But Iowa State absolutely laid this team out last week. And then you go to Baylor, and look, Baylor hasn't played anybody, but Baylor got out 21-3 against Rice at halftime, and then kind of had to hang on a little bit and get a couple late stops in the fourth quarter. And we know that Rice's offense is relatively anemic in terms of yard standards in college football and also points. But I think maybe that was a wake-up call kind of for Baylor. I mean, to say, hey, guys, don't get a little too full of yourselves here. I mean, we kind of messed around a little bit, and it got at least a little dicey in terms of a spite against Rice, a team that really Baylor should theoretically. I mean, I think I'm not sure what they closed at. I think it was in the mid-20s in terms of what they were laying, but it's like this is a team they should have at least beat by about 3 touchdowns, and they didn't. So now they come home, and it's like, let's get back to basics and let's get refocused here, because now we got a conference game and we got to step up in class here against Iowa State from playing Stephen F. Austin and UTSA, and then, of course, Rice on the road. So, yeah, I went here with Baylor. I thought 3 was fair, and I mean Baylor actually last year lost to Ames 28-14, but actually outgained Iowa State 505 to 355. Baylor missed 2 field goals. They got stopped on downs twice in the Iowa State red zone. So if you looked at it, that was a very deceptive final score with Iowa State winning that game by 2 touchdowns. And I know that the market and the preseason rankings like Iowa State a little bit better than Baylor, but I think these teams were all kind of in the muck. If people looked at Oklahoma and Texas as really the top 2 teams in the Big 12, then everybody else was kind of in the middle with the really rebuilding programs, the Kansases and the West Virginias, maybe towards the back of the conference. But everybody, Iowa State, Baylor, Oklahoma State, those teams were really kind of, I guess, all in the middle, if you would say, in the Big 12, kind of in that hierarchy.
One more game to look at here on the college side, and then we'll bounce to the NFL and spend a couple quick minutes on golf. Early kickoff here at Husky Stadium, almost all the way down at the board, 201, 202, USC and Washington. And the perception is generally that the dog side winds up being the sharper side. I think people don't realize how often professionals and long-term winners are willing to lay prices here. And it does seem like so far, Washington laying 9 or 9.5, now up to 10, has been a side that's been preferred early in the week.
Yeah, and I laid 9.5 with Washington. You're now even seeing some 10.5. Matt Fink being announced as the starter for USC. And look, I was on USC last week against Utah as a smallish home dog, and it got there outright. But look, Fink came in after the quarterback, after Slovis got hurt, and he was pretty solid. I mean, he was throwing it down the field, and I mean that's what USC wants to do here now with this air raid offense that the new offensive coordinator Graham Harrell has brought in. And look, Fink made a couple plays, but in the second half, Utah, it seemed like, figured him out a little bit. And I mean, USC absolutely couldn't run the ball last week against Utah. I don't think they're going to be able to do it here. So that's going to force a Matt Fink, who was one of the guys, it ended up being Sears transferring, but one of those guys that was considering transferring in the spring in terms of the quarterback situation. Now he finds himself in the starter role with Slovis not likely to play up in Seattle on Saturday. But now they go to a Washington team that I think, they got that tough loss against Cal at home, which was that was a game that was, of course, rain delayed for a couple hours, finished super late a couple weeks ago. Even finished later than the Hawaii game, which almost seems impossible considering that Hawaii starts at about midnight on on the East Coast for some of these late Saturday night games. But I mean, Washington did looks like maybe they're getting refocused, and maybe that loss gets them refocused. And you saw against Hawaii, they got out 38-0, and then kind of let up a little bit in the second half before they put it away in the fourth quarter with the cover. And then they went to a BYU team, and granted, BYU was probably out of gas off the 2 overtime wins over USC and also over Tennessee the week prior. But Washington just really looked like on a mission. They looked like they had their focus back. And I think they're going to keep that here with the USC coming in with Fink making his first road start. So this is a bit of a tough spot, and I thought under 10 was a little cheap here and laid it with the Huskies.
All right, so as we take a look over on the NFL side of things here, I think this is really interesting to talk about here real quickly, is that when you look at the NFL this season, home teams are not doing well at all. And home favorites, in fact, 9, 20, and 1 against the spread, according to the KillerSports.com database. So what do you make of that? They are 19 and 11 straight up, but 9, 20, and 1 against the spread as a home favorite. Is home field advantage dead in the NFL? Is it just too early to make any determinations with just 3 weeks worth of games? What do you think?
I think when we do kind of our inventory, once we get through to week 17, I think you're going to see probably eventually this is going to regress a little bit to the mean in terms of the home teams, especially the home favorites not covering, because one of the reasons I think it is like that is kind of what we said earlier, is that there's a lot of teams that are interchangeable. There's a couple really, really good teams. There's a couple very solid teams, and then there's a few bad teams. I mean, and that's kind of the way it is. And then you've got all these teams, I think, that are kind of in the middle that haven't at this point really distinguished themselves from the pack. I mean, you look at a couple of the games on the card this week, I think like a Tennessee and Atlanta is an example, or a Carolina, Houston, or I mean, these teams are relatively interchangeable. It seems like they're almost the same team. They do a couple things well, and then they've got a couple things that they don't do well, or they've got, you know, or each team has a significant injury or two. So it kind of makes them like Tennessee and Atlanta. They're both almost like the same team because they both got offensive line issues. So I think that's what makes it a little hard to sometimes lay with these home favorites. And you've seen, I think, in both of those games, they opened like 5, which is kind of a dead number, and then got that down to 4 because it seems like, oh, that number's too high, or maybe people are playing the trends on the road underdogs here, at least in the short-term interim. But, yeah, that's why I think that's why you're seeing some of these trends, at least patterns so far, with these road underdogs, because the teams are very much the same.
Well, as we look back to 2018 in the regular season specifically, home favorites were 75, 85, and 8 against the spread, 46.9%. Again, this year off to just a 31% clip. So would expect it to regress back into that 46, 47% range. I don't know how much of an adjustment odds makers may make in terms of, you know, what they do here with the home favorites, or maybe lowering of home field advantage, something like that. But, you know, again, so far here, home favorites not doing particularly well. I want to tackle this Thursday game with you here because you're on a side I haven't seen too many people on thus far. Philadelphia Eagles obviously very, very banged up coming into the short week against the Green Bay Packers, but seems like you think there's a little bit of value on the Eagles side for this one.
I do, and I liked the Packers going into the season, pick them for a division. I thought that they were a dark horse out of the NFC for the Super Bowl, and still do, but Eagles did get a little bit of better news in terms of the injury report. It did not look as horrible maybe as it did coming out of the game on the Sunday and into Monday morning. Of course, Deshaun Jackson is going to be out, Timmy Jernigan's still out, Ronald Darby, corner out. So not great news by any stretch of the imagination, but They did. Alshon Jeffrey was a full go at practice yesterday, as was J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, the receiver they drafted out of Stanford. Derek Barnett at least had limited practice. Jason Peters was also a participant. So it doesn't look as dire maybe as the situation was, I guess, a couple days ago. And then I look at Green Bay, and they're 3-0, and I think this defense is genuinely improved, but they're still trying to kind of figure some things out on offense. I mean, Denver, if you looked at the stats, really Denver probably should have covered that game at Green Bay last week. That was my one loser in both the Super Contest and the Circa. And Denver had 2 turnovers deep in their own territory, one right before halftime that ended up costing them getting Green Bay a touchdown, where it was a sack fumble. Flacco fumbles deep, and then one where he threw an interception in the second half in their own territory. But the yards were very even, and everything else was fairly even, except the turnover margin and the score. And then with Philadelphia, look, the market bet against them last week, largely because of the injuries. They saw a lot of guys get hurt in that Sunday night game at Atlanta that they lost, even though they had a chance at the end to get the winning score, couldn't get it done. But I think because the market did go against Philadelphia last week and Detroit did get the outright win in Philadelphia, a lot of people are not liking them this week. And then you've got a 3-0 Green Bay team, but yet you're not seeing people just run to the window necessarily to bet Green Bay. It's pretty much been 3.5, 4. I mean, it's not like this line is soared. I mean, I took 4.5, but it's still kind of in that dead zone range, which means to tell you what leads to us to think, I guess, that the market's still, even though they're 3-0, a little lukewarm on Green Bay. So I thought this was a decent enough spot to take the Eagles tomorrow.
Well, like I talked about on yesterday's show with Brian Blessing, when you looked ahead back in mid-May, when CG Technology put out weeks 2 through 16, this was Green Bay -2. So up there at 4.5, 5. Pretty substantial adjustment, maybe a little bit unwarranted early on in the year, maybe the injuries playing a factor. But, again, it will be an interesting game to see there on Thursday night. I want to look at a couple of the other games that you sent over here, games that we haven't talked about yet this week on the show. 255, 256, the Redskins and the Giants. Redskins coming off of not a particularly good look on Monday Night Football. Giants, of course, coming off the big second-half comeback with Daniel Jones. Feels like you're playing against perception and against two extremes from last week.
Yeah, and you really haven't seen a ton of adjustment because we were, of course, on the Green Zone. One of the times that I work is on Monday night during the Monday Night Football game, and we were talking about the fact that this look-ahead line, obviously the books take it down during the game when a team is playing because they don't want to get caught sleeping if, like, a quarterback gets hurt or there's some kind of major injury. But it was 3 essentially on the look-ahead line last week, or the early line that they put out for this particular game. This is during Monday Night Football, and then after Monday Night Football, it's still kind of right at 3 here, and you're even seeing a couple 2.5s out there. Because I think the perception of the Redskins, look, they were out of the game even though they made a little late route. The turnovers absolutely killed them. Case Keenum turned it over 5 times. But, I mean, in terms of the Giants, and I was on them last week, and they got a nice outright win on the money line for me. But, look, this is a different situation. This is now Daniel Jones starting in New York for the first time. And all the talk radio this week, and I mean, this is a really weird thing to kind of say, and not determining the side I was on in this game, but I'm in my local 7-Eleven out here, just in my neighborhood, getting a coffee on Monday, and they actually sell the New York Post out here. And I look on the headline, and it said Dano-Mite, and for Daniel Jones, and it made me think, all of New York talk radio, you're going to have all these people, Rocco from Tom's River, Vinny from Brooklyn, and all the callers into these shows being like, see, I told you this kid was a star. They should have moved on from Eli 4 years ago and all this. And Now he's the toast of the town, Daniel Jones. Now there's something to be said for the fact that the Giants did get a win there, and you got to deal with that all week now. And you're in a different tread kind of here going forward in this situation. Plus the fact that, look, there's going to be no Saquon Barkley, and you can adjust maybe in the middle of a game without having an injured player. But now you got to realize, okay, now we're going into Sunday, and we don't have him to kind of rely on if things go bad, and just feed him the ball. So you have him out of the game as well. You also have, I think, still a pretty poor Giants defense. They were outgained in Tampa by about a little over 100 yards, and Daniel Jones did play, I think, very, very solid down there, and I think it was the right move for them. But I just think that, maybe getting a little carried away on the Giants, and the fact that really the line hasn't moved very much tells me that, okay, they got a nice win down there as an underdog, but maybe we don't want to go all in on this team yet. So I will take the Redskins going on the road with a sense of urgency, being 0-3, to stay within the number and even probably win the game.
I know I'm pushing it a little bit on time here, but Indianapolis, a team that you follow very closely, used to live in Indianapolis. I want to get your take on why you like the Raiders here this week. I was on the Raiders last week against Minnesota. It wound up being a get-right game for the Vikings. They played very well. Oakland did not. What makes you think Oakland plays better here this week against the Colts?
It was a little more of just taking a number, being able to find a 7. The Colts do have some real injury issues, and that's one where maybe it's like a Philadelphia last week where it's too much to overcome, at least to win a 1-week spot. Defensively, Malik Hooker, the safety out of Ohio State, now out 4 to 6 weeks with a knee injury. You also have Darius Leonard, who missed last game, still in the concussion protocol, and those are tricky things. Sometimes you can come back within a week. Sometimes it takes a couple or a few weeks to be able to be cleared. Kenny Moore, another guy that left the game last week with a forearm injury, one of their corners. Their 2 defensive tackles, Tyquan Lewis and Danico Autry, both have some injuries. Danico Autry with an eye injury, Tyquan Lewis with an ankle. Of course, the T.Y. Hilton will be the injury most people focus on because he had a quad injury where he scored that touchdown in the second quarter against Atlanta and then walked immediately to the locker room. No real celebration. A couple high fives, and then immediately went to the locker room. So you've got a Colts team that does have some injuries. And look, I was on them last week, and they got out to a lead on Atlanta, and then Atlanta got right back in the game, and the Colts had to hang on late in the fourth quarter to get a 3-point win. So I just thought it was too many. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily high on the Raiders per se going forward, because now they're in the midst of this really long road trip, and usually the first game is when you have the most focus, and that didn't turn out to be for them in Minnesota, but I just thought the number was a little bit too high. I'm pretty sure you're probably not going to get 7 in any of the contests in Circa or the Westgate Super Contest. It's going to be put right at 6.5, like a lot of these games are, where it forces bettors to make a decision, where some bettors will be like, okay, I'm laying less than a touchdown against a not very good team. And then kind of the sharp guys got to determine, or quasi-sharps, hey, do I go ahead and take less than a touchdown here? Do I like the side that much? So it forces you to make a decision. But I do lean to the Oakland side.
Speaking of decisions, let's look at some you've made here for the Safeway Open out in Napa Valley. Silverado Resort and Country Club, the place for this one. Pretty strong field here for an early season wraparound event. Justin Thomas, the favorite. Cantlay, Matsuyama, Scott, DeChambeau, Benny Yon, Francesco Molinari, Brant Snedeker, who always plays well in California. A lot of big names here in this event. What can you tell us about this event, this course, and some of the guys on your radar for this week?
Yeah, this is a really intriguing event. And then, you have guys that aren't contenders down the board that are at least stories. Of course, Tony Romo in the field, Fred Couples, John Daly, Phil Mickelson, Jim Furyk. So big names of the past. And then a couple guys Graham DeLette off a 2-year absence, and Bo Van Pelt off a 3.5-year absence with injuries teeing it up for the first time. None of those I expect to contend, but looking at this is a Silverado Country Club. It's a traditional, kind of a tight Parklands Classic type of course that really fits the all-around game. I mean, it's not a bear of a course, but the winning score is usually in the mid-teens, 14 to 17 or 18 under par. It is a pretty good test of your game, especially you got to scramble well here. But a couple guys I ended up on in terms of the short prices, I did like Matsuyama simply because at 16 because I like the way he played at the end of the year. I mean, at the BMW where he ended up finishing third, he had 2 rounds of 63. So that tells me that the putting, which is usually kind of the tricky spot for him, he's always a really good ball striker, has kind of come a little bit. And actually, at Eastlake, he didn't really drive the ball very well for the Tour Championship, but still had 2 66s over a 4-round span there. So it's just a matter of putting it all together for him. He was third back here in 2014, so he's got some familiarity here. Thought it was a fair price. Sungjae Im, somebody I usually don't go back to when they lose a playoff the week before, but this guy was a rookie of the year. He's been knocking on the door all year for a win and plays a lot of golf. 5 top 20s in his last 6 starts, including the runner-up last week. Was 4th on his debut here, ranked 6th in the field and tee to green. So this is a guy where a win is coming up. And then a couple horse for courses guys in the mid-price. Kevin Na, 2nd and 7th in 2 trips here, 40 to 1. Ryan Moore, who was in the playoff last year and lost to Kevin Tway at this event. This is around the time of the year, the calendar year. If you look at Ryan Moore historically, he usually wins in the back half of the year in the fall, August, September, October. That's where all of his career wins on the tour really come across. And then one long shot I'll give you before I get out of here, Bronson Burgoon, 80 to 1. You can maybe even find some hundreds on him as well. 3 top 6s and 5 top 20s in his last 6 starts. Had to go back to the Korn Ferry Tour our finals. Was not in the FedEx 125. Kept his card. Think it's given him some confidence. So don't be afraid to maybe take a bomb here, and Bronson Burgoon fits the bill.
Make sure you check out Wes's work on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, when can people catch you on VSIN?
Okay, Mondays 6 to 10 Pacific on the Green Zone, and then I also do split shifts on Thursday and Friday in between the 6 to 10 hours, and then on the weekends on Saturday we go from 2 to 6 p.m. Pacific, and Sundays 3 to 7 Pacific. So we broadcast during the late windows. We're doing live updates of the games, doing some in-running, in-play, live wagering updates. So usually a fun time when you got a full slate of games.
Well, there you go. Make sure you follow Wes on Twitter at Wes Reynolds, the number 1, and check out those VSIN segments. Wes, appreciate your time as always, man. Sorry for running a little bit late today, and we'll talk to you again next week.
No, good to be with you anytime, man.